on defense.
On defense.
Going from making cars to making parts for tanks.
To safeguard freedom and peace in Europe. We had oil crises before. We had world wars before. Our predecessors, they were also facing challenges, and they just, rolled the sleeves down and said, let's get on with it.
The structural economic environment is very different from World War II. It took us 30 years to get into this mess, and we ain't getting out of it in 2 years.
This week, we are talking defense. German industry, including its cars, are famously struggling due to competition with China, high energy costs, and a lot more.
We're going to track the rise of the defense industry and also ask whether it could be a lifeline to save some parts of industry, especially in Germany, but also other parts of Europe as well, which haven't been doing so well. And that's car makers like Volkswagen, but also many other industrial companies as well.
Hey, so starts off with the latest. Are German car makers and their suppliers moving to defense?
Yes, definitely. This has been something that's been going on for the past few years, and we see it increasing with new announcements, new occurrences that are happening in recent weeks even. I think a lot of people have paid attention to Volkswagen, for example, announcing that it was looking for a defense partner for a plant that it plans to get out of, seemingly, none of this is official, next year in 2027. And so that's just the latest instance. It was probably perked up a lot of people's antennas because Volkswagen, obviously a well-known company, to talk about going from making cars to making potentially parts for tanks. I mean, who knows? We're sort of spitballing here. I guess actually in this case, this was tied to the Iron Dome, right? Israel's missile defense. It still remains to be seen what's going to be there at this plant. But this is a good example of what's been going on, is that at a time when the car industry is really suffering a major setback in Germany, across Europe in general, there is another industry that is booming, no pun intended, and that is, of course, a defense industry. And so a lot of these skill sets are very similar, and that's why you're going to see a lot of overlap, whether it's producing materials from suppliers or whether it's the workforces themselves who need to find new employment, because a lot of these car companies are, of course, letting people go.
Okay, and we know, just to zoom out a little bit, that the German economy is in tough times at the moment. And some critics have said that this has actually been a long time coming. And if you look at the success that was around in the economy during the Merkel era, it was all because the cracks were papered over with things like an undervalued euro or cheap Russian energy or suppressed domestic wages, this kind of thing. And now along comes a new government and says, okay, we really need to boost Germany again. But instead of going in a completely different direction, which some people might have wanted, a services economy or this kind of thing, it's doubling down on industry, but just in a different direction. And yes, it's a bit of a different nature as well. We have to admit that. But it doesn't fix things like the skills shortage. It doesn't fix things like high energy costs. So has Germany failed to learn its lesson, and is it kind of papering over the cracks once again, and that it's going to have a comeuppance if just a few years delayed?
Many people would look at the past, especially this period in the 2010s where you really had the kind of banner, years for German industry. The car industry as well did really well. What a lot of people forget is that employment really expanded in the auto industry, and then it began to contract around 2019. So a lot of people would say, look, what's going on is just it's building back from what it was. The bubble is sort of changing. And the other bubble, of course, that we've talked about before, and we talk about a lot at Deutsche Welle, is that Germany's industrial strengths have often, in the last few years, have really accompanied China's purchasing, right? And the fact that China built up as the world's workbench, and that Germany really built those factories for them. Of course, that's a generalization, but really it benefited from China buying, and that also applied to automobiles as well. Volkswagen, for example, German car makers, luxury brands, luxury car makers were really held in high esteem in China. That's changed dramatically. So in a sense, that bubble is over. Is defense a similar bubble? It's hard to say. A lot of this is based on deficit spending, right? And people could point to that. But at the same time, there is recognition within the industry, within the political side as well, that there's going to have to be consolidation at some point within these industries, that not everyone is going to be able to profit long term. There will be those who do survive and thrive, also because maybe they find export markets. You look at a company like Rank, for example, one of the big sort of suppliers here that's defense companies that's really done banner numbers recently. I think they had their first quarter this year. They had a record number of orders, and they do things like gearboxes, transmissions for a lot of tanks, this kind of stuff. If you look at them, then you just see that they are an international player. And they say, look, we are going for the US market and for other markets. We're not just here to equip Europe necessarily, but we're going to equip whoever's coming to us in a sense. And so you're going to have a few players who really emerge from this and aren't just sort of tied to this kind of rearmament of Europe. But if it's a bubble, it's probably also going to last for a decent amount of time. There is an acknowledgement that a lot is needed in Europe. But yes, you're right. How long does this last? Is it sustainable? And then who will survive and who won't? It remains to be seen. Who knows?
You basically make engines for everything except for cars. So agricultural construction machines, generators, and this kind of thing. And now you're pivoting towards defense. I think you may have had a toe in it before, but now you're really going for it. Why?
Yeah, it has several reasons. And in fact, there are three reasons. First reason, of course, is, it is a market that develops strongly, where the growth is above, let's say, ordinary market growth. And that's, for me, always a precondition to go into any business. And that's certainly the case in Europe and in Germany in particular since 2022. And we reacted fairly quickly after, the Russian attack on the Ukraine. Number two is, of course, it's not just relevant that there is a market. It's also relevant that you bring some knowledge, some competency into the field, and that's the way you just mentioned. 160 years of engines for everything which is not on the road, off highway, and the requirements for these engines they have to be extremely robust. They have to function on high altitude, or let's say in a mining environment, high temperatures, low temperatures. So perfectly suitable also for any sorts of military equipment. So in business terms, we would call it sort of the right to play and right to win. Although we're not talking about playing and winning in this context. I need that to be very clear. And the third reason, we are now. We are in the center of Europe, and we are very, very close to a front and in a threat which we hadn't really have for quite some time. Mm. So for us, it's also a sort of a responsibility we have to bring to safeguard freedom and peace in Europe. And we feel not only prepared, but actually also almost obliged to make a contribution here. So these are the three reasons why we moved into defense.
Now, one thing that you briefly touched on was that pre-2022, around then, there was a kind of unease among some companies in Germany about participating in this sector outside of those big players with the big names. And there has been a cultural shift since then. I think a lot of people are realizing that Germany needs to defend itself, and that's certainly what the government's position is, that this industry needs ramping up. Was that also a cultural shift for you personally and for the company as well?
Well, for me personally, it wasn't, because I came from a background of defense. For the company, honestly speaking, I wasn't sure how the employees would react at that point in time, for exactly the reason you just mentioned in your question, right? I wasn't sure, but the first time I addressed it in front of all our employees here at the main facility in Cologne, I was very transparent. I told it to them exactly why this is not only good for Deutz, it's good for the employees, but also good for society and for the freedom of the Western world. And I received applause for that. I received applause. There's always the one or other who says, "Oh, we don't want to get involved in anything relating to weapons," and that's fine, and that's totally acceptable. And we may have lost one or two employees who said, "Oh, we really don't want to get engaged in that." But the vast majority of our people, they were actually reacting, I would always say, enthusiastically. The engineers, who need to do some development on the products.
Okay, and I just want to kind of zoom out and look at German industry more broadly. What's your diagnosis for the state of German industry right now?
That's a good one, and that's a very wide one. We Germans, we have, I think, typically a tendency to be always a bit more on the complainy than on the
no.
What?
Exactly. I'm sure I would receive here a lot of counter arguments. But I personally believe we can do much more than we sometimes say and will again. So I try with Deutz and my leadership team and the entire company. I try always to phrase, there are lots of challenges out there, and we always have a tendency to believe that the current challenges are unheard of and that 20, 30, 50, 70 years ago, the world was so much easier. But let's face it, it wasn't. I mean, we had oil crises before, we had world wars before, and there were so many moments when people probably thought, okay, that is the end of the world and of society or whatever, and right. So I don't want to talk what's currently happening down, not at all. But I'd like to sort of remind everyone that our predecessors, they were also facing challenges, and they just, rolled the sleeves down and said, okay, let's get on with it. And that's what I believe is a bit lacking in German industry, maybe also in German politics. But we try to be a blueprint for the group who is actually seeing that in a more sort of optimistic way.
With this German-wide industrial move towards defense, are we seeing innovation-led growth here, or is this just state-led industrial preservation?
Now, I believe innovation is very strong, right? I mean, obviously it needs, because the end customer is always a government, right? So it needs both. It needs funding from governments, from the respective armies. But on the other hand, we see so much innovation right now, particularly in this field of unmanned vehicles, and it is most likely has been initiated by the war in the Ukraine, where a country that suddenly was put under the biggest pressure one could probably expect needed to react quickly, and then suddenly in and around Kiev, almost like an innovation hub emerged, which was certainly not, long-term planned and funded. And it just shows how a society, an industry with an engineering knowledge and background can innovate. And that's what we see in Germany as well. In particular in the south of Germany, but not only there, so many really fantastic companies with great ideas emerge.
Right.
And so it needs both, in short. It needs both.
Aren't you worried whether a switch to defense, as many companies are undergoing at the moment, not just yours, that whether that's going to be sustainable in the long term? I mean, at the moment, it's deficit financed in Germany. Demand is mostly for governments like the German government, which, it could change its policy if another government comes along. And of course, this switch doesn't fix any of the underlying issues. You're very optimistic, but yet it doesn't get rid of high energy costs. It doesn't get rid of slow adaptation in some areas, or the skills shortage. So aren't you worried that this move into defense may actually leave some companies, maybe even yours, more vulnerable, if not now, than a few years down the road?
Well, that would be true if one would now decide and say we go totally in defense. Yeah, and that's not our approach. We asked ourselves very clearly, with the abilities we have, with also the footprint we have, the people we have, how can we support in fields which are, clearly macroeconomic megatrends, and defense is one of them. But I would not go all in and, completely transform Deutz from an industrial sort of engineering company to a defense-only company. We said we want to be more broad, more resilient. And defense is certainly one of the pillars, which is currently a very strong pillar. And I personally believe is also going to be a strong pillar in the next 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. But it's not the only pillar. And that is reflected in our company strategy. Besides, obviously, preserving what we have done in the last 20, 30 years, in particular, engines for off-highway applications. That's extremely relevant. We're also investing a lot of money and resources into new technologies, battery electric technology for exactly those sectors. And we have also decided to move into the energy sector with the knowledge we have, engines for backup power generation. And so that's why, it was always unwise to go only in one field, and so that's why we feel we're very well prepared. And I could only advise that to everyone else as well. Never put all eggs in one basket, to quote Warren Buffett.
I'm wondering, we've spoken about this, that the U.S. has been pushing for Europe to kind of stand on its own 2 feet for a while, since it, very vocally in this Trump administration, definitely in Trump 1 as well. But is the U.S. happy about these moves that the U.S. that Europe is making right now, or is the U.S. maybe bristling under this new move to Europe for Europe to do its own thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there always is this kind of tension. So the U.S., for instance, wants the Europeans to do more on their own, but they also want the U.S. that want Europeans to buy U.S. kit, right? They want us to they
Yeah.
want to do foreign military sales. So so there's always this tension, and it's going to be that way in Germany as well, where the parliamentarians will want only to buy kind of German systems from for the German military, but in some cases there's just not the business case. So I think that that there is this balance, and I think it's incumbent upon leaders to have to be careful with their rhetoric. Because there was a lot of talk about sovereign capabilities in
Yeah,
Europe, and
we hear that all the
and
time.
the SAFE program is but there are limitations to what you can do, and even the U.S. has said this. Some of the U.S. rhetoric has been strong in sort of like do more Europe, but even the Secretary of War Hegseth says this is not America alone, right? So it's finding that balance between building, and I think you're seeing actual progress in Europe in terms of, if you look at the percent of gross domestic product on defense across the NATO alliance countries, it's gone up. It's over 2% for all of
Yep.
them, which is the first time really since the Cold War, and for all the tough rhetoric from the Trump administration, it would be hard to see how that wouldn't happen without it. So it's like it's a balance of it's good for the governments to step forward, but we don't want to get totally out of joint with each other either.
So what do you look for in the past for examples of what this looks like, where we're going with it? I mean, when we talk about a defense industrial cycle, for example, are we going back to the Cold War to find something similar to what's happening right now? Because obviously during the World Wars, there was massive rearmament, but that's very, very different scenario than what we're in now. So what do you look to kind of, get an idea of what we're in at the moment?
I look at a couple of things. I mean, I think the environment, the structural economic environment is very different from World War II. People kind of hark back to that, but it's not really, I think, a good example. A better example is during the Afghanistan Iraq war, we had a big problem with roadside bombs. The IEDs, they were called, improvised explosive devices. And there was an effort the U.S. led to develop what's called MRAPs, or mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles. And that was a tremendous acquisition effort that within 3 years led to the production of 16,000 vehicles from, which is a dramatic kind of production, and saved hundreds of and even thousands of lives. And that was done through using a U.S. buying using an existing design that came from South Africa or even Rhodesia, right? So, so it was a partnership with a design that was not U.S. They've had, they did a lot of multi-sourcing, buying equipment from all over the world, high-grade aluminum, high-grade steel, and then to create it and then get it to the front. So these kind of cooperative efforts were done, and there were other industries involved, other companies in other countries. So this kind of model, much more kind of concentrated collaborative approaches. I think you can do that through the NATO alliance, through cooperative procurement efforts. You can do it through some of the efforts that we've seen with Ukraine, supplying Ukraine, where you've developed some of these networks on drones and so on. So I think that model is going to be, I think, where governments can help promote it, but it's going to be more of an industry kind of collaborative effort. Government's got to set the environment, and then companies can from across the continent, in the case of Europe, and transatlantically can collaborate to build and deploy systems.
Yeah, following you down that train of thought, Jerry, it's making me think about supply chains, right? And earlier in the show, we were hearing about how China is such a mega player in the car industry now that it's really upended the German car industry. And that's why we see so many automotive makers moving to defense, for example. And thinking about supply chains, I'm wondering, is it possible for sovereignty, right? This buzzword, for it to actually exist? Can China, for example, be removed from a supply chain? Because we saw the way that China used rare earth minerals last summer against the U.S., right? Export restrictions. So I'm just wondering, is decoupling from China in these kinds of supply chains for the U.S. or for Europe, is that possible?
Well, it took us, I like to say it took us 30 years to get into this mess. And we ain't getting out of it in 2 years, right? So these kind of, we let the market kind of, go overseas because it was the most efficient, effective way to do it. But what happened is China used industrial policy to get dominant positions in rare earths, magnets, and a number of other areas. But so it's going to take concentrated effort. It's going to take collaborative effort to get out of that. You see that a lot with I think Germany is one of the biggest magnet makers outside of so I think we collaborate. I think it's magnets that we collaborate. U.S. companies buy a lot from German companies because they have expertise in that. And so I think you're going to see more of this, what we call either onshoring or friendshoring. How do we get out of the China business, which means, strengthening foreign direct investment controls. So you can keep businesses, that are German owned, likewise American, and then just building the capacity in markets that can compete against China. It's going to require, and this is not a kind of, cannot be just a singular country approach. It has to be done through, cooperative mechanisms and informal or formal alliances.
Hi YouTube, you've been watching a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip.
And if you liked what you've seen so far, you can check out more of our episodes in our playlist right here on YouTube.
Yeah, and you can get all of the full episodes if you scan the QR code that's on your screen right now.
But until next time, thank you so much for watching
The Dip. See ya. Bye-bye.